Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside David Corbin. Glad to have you with us to explore the ideas behind today's headlines.
My left eye sees pollution. Those dirty fuels are burning. The earth's whole climate's churning. Clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill. Fossil fuels are cheap. Wind and solar too steep. Drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division. Shuttered mind, worse than blind. 2020
Sorry, Dave.
vision.
Doing well, Matt. How about yourself? You haven't started school yet, or that's about to happen this next week?
Yeah, right. Coming up. Yeah, we're going up to Fenway Park on Monday for the Labor Day game. 4 hours up, 4 hours back. Hopefully 2.5 hours of victory in between. But after that, yeah, we have to get down to the grind.
Okay, good. Well, we've finishing up our having visited relatives and then had relatives come in for 2 weeks. We don't have an engagement yet, but I mentioned Cam, the law student from Notre Dame, and asked my permission for Catherine's hand. So she still has to say yes, but we,
Okay.
of course, jumped the shark and celebrated as if it was a done deal. Especially my son Patrick, which if you know Patrick on the show, he has Downs, and he's like, I've got the bachelor party all under control.
That's awesome.
We're going to Vegas. We're going to get a convertible. So,
Oh, yeah.
so we were all excited, but I think Pat was the most excited.
Yeah.
So a lot of joy and interesting time in life. I mean, you don't have grandkids. I don't have grandkids. We're getting older. So
I know.
it's one of those things. Yeah.
Things
But
on the
yeah,
horizon.
these are the joys of being 50 something, right? There are a lot of hardships too, taking care of parents and all the rest, but yeah, a new era. So all good.
Well, in the meantime, we've had some news on the DIA Today front. So my wife is very good at social media type of things. And so she figured out we can get all of our episodes up on YouTube without any real trouble. So she did that, and they are now all available to you at DIA Today. So not the greatest visual. You got a nice image of our logo for 45 minutes while you listen to us. But a lot of people are just consuming podcasts on YouTube these days, apparently. So if that's how you like to get podcasts, you can now go there. You're not stuck with Apple or Spotify or wherever else you want to go. So anyway, and they'll be going up there. Every new episode will go up there automatically. Should be able to find those relatively quickly on a Saturday when we put an episode out. We're also doing a little bit on Instagram again. So we had a student that set us up with Instagram a couple years ago and kind of got us organized there. But my wife Rachel's trying to get that rolling as well. So we'll see. Small beginnings usually on these things, but give you a few more opportunities to engage with us.
So we're moving on today to discuss the principle of prudence. We have covered to this point 5 principles that were in our 2010 book. And those principles were equality, responsibility, honor, justice, and then last time, lawfulness. Quick review of those principles, equality being the recognition that the dignity of all is required to have a government that treats one another in a principled manner, in which the body politic as well treats one another in a principled manner. Second, that we need to take responsibility for our actions, that we are moral agents. Third, honor, that when we do things as leaders, we do so in a way in which we're aiming toward the common good, not simply rallying people around our own individual cause or our desire for office or our desire to become Caesar-like. Justice, the kind of culminating principle of the American regime. There is such a thing as a common good. It's often difficult to achieve, but you'll never achieve it with factious activity. And then finally, lawfulness, that the rule of law helps as a means to that end of the common good, but lawfulness in and of itself cannot supplant justice. It has to work with justice for a regime to work well. So then finally, that brings us to today. And there's been an application for each of these principles, but I think that the most common application of intellectual virtue in each of these cases is prudence. So what is the principle of prudence, Matt? And how does it kind of connect to all of these other five principles we've covered?
This is another principle with a long history, lots of comment upon it in the history of political philosophy, and of course, just statesmanship over the years. The idea of prudence fundamentally is wise, practical action. And so you think about being able to join the appropriate means to pursuing an end, and to find those appropriate means and then pursue that end in a way that actually advances the cause, in this case of justice. So we recognize that in a democratic community, it's not always easy to do the right thing. You don't always have a majority in favor of the right thing. And sometimes the right thing is a little bit unclear. So a Republican statesman is working toward advancing the cause of justice by understanding where is the public right now, where is the majority, where is the consensus, what part of justice is available today, and then choosing measures that consolidate that measure of justice and then begin to push the boundaries further and to try to make a case. As you're arguing for a part of justice, you're making the case, at least implicitly, for all of justice. And so over time, you hope that that prudential action will lead to a greater realization of right behavior politically, both for you and for your community.
So prudence, in a way, is that element, that orientation that is archetypical of working through the means that you have at your disposal to arrive at that just end. So it takes into account the rule of law. It takes into account
Right.
principles of equality, responsibility, and honor that go into justice. But it works within the contingencies of the human experience, what's in play at a certain time. So it very much relies upon a certain mindset, and that we don't all have, because even the best of us who try to be prudent most of the time can be drawn away from prudence because of the other aspects of our human person. So in our book, we mentioned that prudence is not the same as grandstanding. So can you tell us what the difference is between a prudent statesman and a politician who's just simply grandstanding?
And one of the challenges here is that it's not always obvious in the moment. But the grandstander is the person who is really pretty well content to lose on principle, right? Who doesn't mind if they can get the social media, if they can get the headlines, if they can get the viral video, then they're pretty well happy with the result. And that can connect back to our office seeker we were talking about earlier, or somebody else who enjoys the plaudits, perhaps, of the activist class in their party, but who's not really ultimately looking for the best way to advance the cause. So they want to make a big show of standing on principle, and they want to perhaps introduce legislation that has no chance of ever winning, but I put that bill in there, and so I can go out there on the stump and collect the plaudits of many for that, but doesn't really have any plan actually for achieving their goal. And so it's really a selfish act on the part of the grandstander who's not concerned with the common good or with the advancing of the cause of justice, but actually with their own standing and their own position.
Yeah, I was just going to say, as you were talking, that there is definitely a narcissistic element within the grandstander, that raising the volume, attracting attention to his or her person is easy to do. But at the end of the day, you may have gained some attention for yourself or secured yourself, but to the detriment of the cause. So on the other end of the spectrum, you have not the grandstander, but the person who's always willing to concede. What's the difference between prudence and concession?
Yeah, and again, this can be a little bit unclear in the moment, right? It's because a person who's prudent is going to make compromises. And those that want to stand on principle 100% all the time are going to consider that person perhaps somebody who's sold out, somebody who's conceded key points or key ideas or key agenda items. But the person who concedes is a person who makes the means the end, who makes the deal the thing, rather than the cause that the deal is supposed to serve. And so it can be the case that you can have a deal that looks pretty good on paper in terms of you got 2/3 of what you wanted versus other side getting 1/3, but it can actually move you further away from the long-term realization of your goal. So if you give up a key principle or premise to your argument, in order to make a deal, you can actually lose out in the long run. In the book, we talked about this in terms of tax policy, where it seems like a place where there's all kinds of room for compromise. But what happened, this was going back to the tax cuts in the George W. Bush administration. He cut taxes, but he did so in a way that increased the progressivism of the tax system, which made it more difficult down the road for further cuts that would not be easily demagogued as tax cuts for the rich. We know this happened when President Trump came along, wanted to cut taxes, and it was argued that those tax cuts would only benefit the rich. Well, part of that was because the rich were paying a greater proportion of taxes after George W. Bush tax cut went into play. So the consequence of all that was an imprudent approach to tax cutting made it more difficult to realize the principle down the road of a just and modest tax regime.
These orientations of grandstanding and being the person who concedes all the time, they definitely play into politics. But as we mentioned in the last episode, they play into a lot of different aspects of human life. They play into marriages, they play into parenting, they play into how people come around a board and deal with issues. I mean, there's a danger right there to be drawn towards being the grandstander around in the boardroom, or the person who always concedes. And there are certain temptations to fall into one of these categories, because at the end of the day, both seem to kind of secure the place of the person who's always conceding and considered to be agreeable. And to the degree that that group loves agreeableness, you're in when you concede. Or on the other end of the spectrum, the person who's drawn to grandstanding, that person is so principled. But at the end of the day, neither of these two options or orientations are going to get a marriage, a family, a church, a business, an organization to where they need to be. So we offered up a third idea, this idea of how prudence aligns with compromise, but a right type of compromise. And what is that right type of compromise, Matt?
Well, there's several elements to it. I think the first is to have a realistic assessment of what is politically possible at a given point in time on the issue we're talking about. Where is the consensus? What is the majority? What is the 65% or the 55% position on the issue? And then recognize, okay, that's where the public is at the moment. Now, the next question is, does achieving that, does getting that far, or having a policy that achieves that, does that cause me to give up a fundamental principle? Does that make it more difficult down the road, as we were just saying, to achieve something more important or a greater measure of justice? If the answer is yes, then there may not be a good compromise at the moment. There may be, because we're in an absolute conflict perhaps over fundamental principles, might be stuck. We might have to just pull back and just make the argument, right? Try to advance the cause of justice through persuasion and build a consensus for the right if there is no consensus that can lead in that direction at a given point in time. But if there is, if that 55% group is willing to take some step in the right direction, then you take that. And in doing so, in making the case for it, you lay down the premises for a greater measure of justice down the road. Right? So you don't make the case that this is the be all and end all, this is the final destination on this policy, but you argue that it's good, and you show people why something better might make sense on the principles that they're apparently willing to entertain in agreeing to this first step toward justice.
We in the book spent a lot of time on the years leading up to the Civil War in discussing Lincoln's prudent orientation. One of the things I think that comes out of the Civil War is this, okay, we can't simply concede, we can't simply grandstand, we need a new way of approaching American politics. There's a wonderful history written by Louis Menand, an MIT historian, called the Metaphysical Club, in which he outlines kind of the pathway of a new way of looking at politics. And it really begins with Ralph Waldo Emerson and his impact on a variety of different thinkers. I think the main thinker in the book emphasized is the jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who suggests after the Civil War that the problem is having a debate about justice, even kind of talking and thinking through what justice is. He says in an important part of his jurisprudence that certitude leads to violence. So let's get rid of objective truth. Let's get rid of that discussion of justice, and let's move to legal pragmatism to solve the issue. So is prudence the same thing as legal pragmatism, or is it different, Matt? And in what way is it different?
Yeah, that's a great historical reference point, because there's another wave of this after World War II, the same kind of thing. What's the story that's told in some elite circles about World War II? Well, the problem was absolute confidence or absolute principles, right? Hitler wasn't evil because he had evil ideals. He was evil because he had ideals, because he had certain things he was willing to fight for. And so the solution is that there's nothing we're willing to fight for. Right? Holmes' line was, every dog loves its own bone. So all principles of justice are just our bone that we want to hold on to, and there's nothing more to them. So that can't be the answer, because the reality is, as Lincoln would say over and over again with respect to slavery, you can't tell people not to care about things they have to care about. People do care about justice. People do care about slavery in his day, and people care about anti-Semitism, and they care about communism, and they care all the great injustices of the world. People actually care about, and so you can't say, well, we're just not going to talk about that. We're just going to ignore that, just ignore the problem of abortion because it causes controversy and difficulty, because it's simply impossible to ignore a morality and a moral principle that is evident to all. And so we have to find a way to advance a cause of justice in these areas that doesn't just ignore the moral qualities of the issue.
You see this in a courtroom as well, right? Any professor of political philosophy like we are, you get a little frustrated in a courtroom because, oftentimes the role of the judge is not to think about what justice is in the case, but to split the difference in a legally pragmatic way that, quote unquote, resolves the issue. But people rarely come out of courtrooms happy about the resolution because they still feel like an injustice has been done to them. Which kind of brings into play kind of the next segment of the show. One of the greatest speeches of all time, if not the greatest speech of all time, at least modern history, is Lincoln's second inaugural. And Lincoln, as someone who is looking over, say, a courtroom or the ship of state, is realizing that you've had these two antagonists, and he can't simply argue, in that speech that the parties that were involved in a civil war that killed hundreds of thousands didn't care about the things they cared about,
right?
But he had to kind of come up with a prudent way forward. So let me read a little bit from that second inaugural. I'll just pare it down to a couple different parts and get your feedback on what Lincoln is saying. So he begins the inaugural, or second paragraph of the inaugural. He's writing, of course, in 1865. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. So here Lincoln takes up where things were in 1861. What's he trying to get at here? Why go back in history 4 years, Matt?
Question that he's really wrestling with in this speech is, where did this war come from? Why did we have a civil war? And there's a couple levels that he deals with that question on here. And I mean, early on, he's kind of giving you the well-worn path, the story as you would have experienced it, as he experienced it, and coming to Washington, making his way from Springfield, Illinois, on his way. And as he's doing that, we've got states seceding, and there's various negotiations that are underway. And everybody in theory says, oh, no, we don't want to fight. But then the question is, well, how do we have a fight then? And the answer is, well, because each side had something that they weren't willing to give up. And those two things were incompatible. And so there was no way at that point, and we can talk about the details of this, but there was no way at that point to negotiate some settlement that was able to achieve the goals of both sides.
And Lincoln does get into the details. And I think it's important with a prudent orientation to talk about the details. So in the next paragraph, what were the details? 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. So here, these were the particulars, and this was his orientation. Keep it where it is.
And so what Lincoln's implicitly saying is there was a compromise available. And that was the compromise that had been around going all the way back to the time of the founding, really. Namely, that you would put restrictions on the extension of slavery while tolerating it, at least temporarily, in the places where it already existed. That was the line the Republican Party had drawn when they formed in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And that was really the tradition going back to even before the Constitution, as you had the earliest states deciding to end slavery, and yet there was no language in the Constitution that allowed for some kind of national banning of slavery short of a constitutional amendment. So this was something that was going to have to be worked out over time. And the way that had happened time and time again was by putting limits on slavery whenever new territory was acquired. And so that compromise was still available. Had the South been content to maintain slavery where it existed for some indefinite period of time and to have it restricted from new territories, that was the compromise that Lincoln had proposed and really stood upon his entire political career. But they weren't content with that anymore. Now the South was saying, no, slavery is a good thing, not something that we're stuck with, that we have to figure out a way out of eventually. But no, it's a good thing, and it should be extended because all good things should be extended, should grow and develop and be adopted by more people. And so that fundamental conflict over the goodness of slavery is the issue that can't be resolved leading up to the Civil War, and upon which there's really no room for compromise.
So an accounting of particulars, but in the next paragraph, an accounting that both parties believe they had a just cause, as you just said. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding, but key. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other.
This is an interesting part of the speech because you notice he switched from the past tense to the present tense right at the point where he introduces the Bible and God. And from that point on in the speech, he is really moving to something like a reflection upon the divine will in all this. So he's worked out as best he can the particulars politically of what's happened going back 4 years and working his way forward. But there's questions that haven't really been answered. There's still a war that came without anybody seemingly wanting to have it. And again, we've given kind of a historical explanation of that. But what Lincoln begins to argue is that the divine actor behind all this, God, is working out his purposes, which happen to be contrary to the purposes of both North and South. And so what we find here as Lincoln's unfolding this is that there's a basic problem of contradiction, right? That God cannot be both for and against the same thing at the same time. God can't not be in favor of extending slavery and restricting it. Those two things can't be held, and no person could either, right? This is a limitation bound up in the nature of reason. You can't hold two opposite principles at the same time in the same relationship. And so because of that, because of this fundamental clash, then there's no way that these two parties who are both really praying for victory rather than the glory of God, rather than the vindication of his purposes, right? They're praying for their cause rather than for his, but there's no way that both can be satisfied. And in fact, neither is satisfied according to Lincoln's analysis of things.
So leading up to the Civil War, Lincoln, in applying prudence, is willing to make some political compromises, those that include opposing the extension of slavery into new territories, but allowing it where it currently is. But when you begin to make moral compromises, such as the Kansas-Nebraska Act does, it says, okay, just let people vote on whether a human being is a human being. It's at that point where you cannot make a compromise. You should not make a moral compromise. So in sum, we see the limits of prudence, given the coming of the Civil War, where you can't compromise when the clash of principles is absolute. So as we come near the end of the war, Lincoln is given a proposition and that he will not accept. And what is that proposition, Matt?
Lincoln's elected and stood his whole life on moral opposition to slavery and non-extension of slavery into new territories. And then as soon as he's elected, people say, you know what? We got to work out a deal with the South. How about we try popular sovereignty? And Lincoln says, well, first of all, I just ran against that. So I won the election on opposition to popular sovereignty. So why should I concede my victory to those that lost just because you think that might be a better solution to the problem? If that was the consensus, I wouldn't be president or president-elect, but Stephen Douglas would be. But also because there's an immorality embedded, as you were just saying, in the whole idea of popular sovereignty and saying, well, we're just going to allow local populations to decide whether this person is or is not a person, and whether this person should or should not be enslaved. That's not a question that ought to be resolved in a vote up, vote out, vote down kind of way. And so there was a fundamental moral principle that had to be upheld, even while Lincoln worked through what was possible politically in working toward the ultimate extinction of slavery. And so what fails here, and this is I think a good lesson for our own day, is the principle of localism. So, one of the things we often hear people say, well, we have such division between red states and blue states, and we've talked about before, but it's really more like, blue cities and, purple suburbs and then the red countryside. But however you want to describe that geographically, we say, well, let's just allow the cities to do their thing and the country to do its thing, and the red states can do their thing and the blue states can do their thing. But while that works in some cases, right? There's some places where that makes perfect sense and is at least justifiable and manageable. It doesn't really work on the most fundamental questions. And so you end up in a situation where you're saying, well, we're going to have an absolute ban on abortion in, say, a dozen states around the country. In other places, it's going to be whatever you want, whenever you want it. Well, no one who's concerned about the issue of abortion can really be content with that resolution. Right? There's something fundamental to the issue that can't be resolved by simply saying, well, if you like abortion, go move to California. If you don't like it, go move to Alabama. Well, it's not about that, right? We're talking about the life of a human being. And so it's not enough to say, well, this jurisdiction can do it and that one can't. We have to go deeper than that. And that's where the challenge arises, because this is the kind of compromise that looks attractive because it kind of gives more people what they want. You move to your blue state because you're a blue person. You move to your red state because you're a red person. But it really doesn't actually address the fundamental issue.
Yeah, and it represents an admixture of what we were talking about earlier, this legal pragmatism combined with principled localism. And it's kind of a reversion back to that norm. And I think we see it, right, with where we stand after Roe v. Wade was overturned.
Yeah.
Are we done, with the issue? So we've kind of given in where Lincoln had not given in,
yeah.
right, to this principle of localism combined with, okay, this is going to be the best way to handle the situation moving forward. So now, as you mentioned, we have 23 states that have affirmed or passed laws expanding access to abortion. 12 essentially have bans in place. 7 ban it after 6 weeks, 2 after 12 weeks, and 1 after 18 weeks. And then you have 8 states remaining that are in legal or political limbo. So, returning here to the close of Lincoln's speech, and this might be a good application to the issue of abortion today, Lincoln says, "The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses. For it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills it, that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil should be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn with a sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. I mean, an amazing statement followed with this, Matt, which rounds out the conversation about prudence. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.
And it's really those two paragraphs together. I mean, they have to go together. The whole thrust of the first 3/4 of the speech is to get us to this point of national humility. Because at the end of a war, when you're talking about a civil war, we're talking about people that have to come together somehow again and have to somehow be fellow citizens and somehow have to live under the same laws. And you just can't be fighting the war forever. The war has to actually end. How do you get there? Well, most people are going to be hating their neighbor rather than loving their neighbor coming out of a civil war. And so if you can convict everybody of this national sin of slavery and say, no, like, look, we've actually gotten off light, believe it or not, as horrible as this war has been, it's God's mercy to us that he's limited its destruction to what it has been. And so if we're actually brought to a point of profound humiliation, then we might perhaps be able to hear about malice toward none and charity for all. Otherwise, if we're at a point of vengeance, we're still high and mighty, we're still proud of our cause, we're still determined to win the victory and to demonstrate the justice of all that we are and all that we do, then there's no way we're going to be able to embrace a principle of malice toward none and charity for all. And so Lincoln has to bring us down to that point where we're willing to entertain that and to see again the humanity of North and South, of black and white, and to think about, going back to the other principles we've been talking about, how do we actually craft policies toward the common good, recognizing the equality of all, and move forward as a single nation.
So the bigger the question of justice, the more necessary is the application of the intellectual virtue of prudence, but likewise the moral virtue of humility.
Right. And that's a difficult pairing, right? I mean, it's one thing to talk about historical examples of this done well or done poorly, or to suggest perhaps ways that this could be done better in other situations. But this is not easy. I mean, in the moment, prudent statesmanship, when the stakes are so high, when the issues are so fundamental, it's really the most difficult thing there is for a statesman. And so that's why we justly recognize and praise and honor the memory of those who have actually attained to this virtue, because it's such a rare virtue to be found and yet so essential in those times of crisis.
So moving forward to today, we still have remnants of the issue of slavery and the issue of abortion present. But I think one of the issues that today kind of sparks a similar need for prudence and humility is on this question of how do we prudently deal with what an American citizen is? So we have the introduction of DEI, we have the immigration question, and we have a large divide over those two things. So how might we apply that in this case?
So if you ask the question, what's the common denominator between DEI and immigration, your first thought might be, well, woke, right? We're wanting to unravel woke, undo woke, and return to ideas that predated that movement. And of course, that's part of the story. But I think you're getting at a key underlying ideal here, which is namely what constitutes right citizenship in a republic. And so both these issues really circle around that issue. The immigration question is, who do you invite to become a citizen, ultimately? And the DEI question is, well, how do you shape the people that are already here toward responsible citizenship?
So I think, the question on the American citizenship is, how do you maintain the principle that there truly is something that is American citizenship,
right?
Yet make political compromises that allow for that idea, that principle to come back into being and to be the norm. And there's an article by a historian, James Hankins, in The American Mind that was published the middle of this month, titled "Topple Your Woke Idols." And in a very Lincolnian fashion, he suggests that we're not going to overcome this debate simply by agreeing to an easy assimilation, that we actually have to topple the woke idols. We actually have to reestablish the honor of American citizenship and what it means to be an American citizen and what the attributes of that citizenship are. And so he is very much in this article upholding the moral principle that citizenship is an important thing. But I think in a good way, in a modest way, in a humble way, he suggests a political compromise that runs through our K-12 education system, our public school system, that suggests that this thing ought to be taught as real and good, our history not as perfect, as
Right.
absolutely good, and applying the principle of citizenship, but uphold the principle and make a call out to young men and women in this country that this thing is something important. You're not simply entitled to it. You have to fill your part of being a good citizen, and you ought to want to welcome in others who want to be good citizens. So do you think, as I've argued here, that we see in Hankins, argument, some application of Lincolnian prudence on this very important question in our time?
I do, absolutely, because really the challenge of citizenship in the United States or in the American context is that on the one hand you can say, well, a citizen is sort of defined by the history and the culture of a given people. Right? What does it mean to be a good citizen? Well, remember when President Obama said, well, the Greeks have Greek exceptionalism and America has American exceptionalism and everybody has their own exceptionalism. Well, in a certain sense, that may be true, but that's not entirely the case. And that's what we're talking about, because the American founding was built upon claims of self-evident truth and universal principles. So the idea is that there's actually a model of citizenship given to us in our founding documents. Understand the importance of government by consent, responsibility we talked about, moral responsibility to govern in accordance with those ideals, and to protect natural rights of all, and human equality. I mean, all the things we're talking about over this series of podcasts and chapters in the book are things that are part of really what ought to be an American conception of citizenship, and don't dictate what we should do about healthcare or how we should think about tax policy necessarily, at least not in all the particulars, but they do guide us overall in ways that should be consensus building. And so if we're talking about what it means to be an American citizen, we have some content to that goes beyond just, well, you happen to be here, or your parents were here when you were born, or those kinds of things. We have real moral content, political content to those ideas that we can then take into the public schools, private schools, home schools of America, and say, this is what it means to exercise your citizenship in a country that has a certain understanding of its role and its place in the world.
Yeah, that's important, right? That there are attributes of American citizenship in its purest form. This recognition of the equality of others, recognizing that you're a moral agent, that you're responsible, right? Being honorable, having a sense of what it means to be honorable, recognizing kind of what justice is, even though there are debates around it, and following the rule of law. I mean, and then being prudent about it. All of these things that we've talked about the last couple of months go into the proper definition of American citizenship. And multiculturalism doesn't get us to where we need to go,
right?
Which is what is being offered by President Obama at the time, that everyone has their exceptional thing. But something like a cross-culturalism where you recognize that cultures are different without undermining the truth of your culture, your citizenship, and your willingness to accept someone else within your country if they're willing to abide by those principles and make them part of their everyday habits as an American citizen. So it's kind of nice that we end in this way, because yes, prudence is the pathway forward, but a prudence that recognizes a standard, a prudence that's willing to be humble in terms of its looking in the past as to whether that standard has been applied in every situation, but a humility that doesn't give up on the excellence of the thing itself.
Yeah, it's just driving humility, right? You recognize the faults and you aim to improve upon that rather than just be despairing over the faults and the failures. You say, okay, those faults and failures point to our weakness as human beings. There's lessons to be learned from that, but we also have an ideal that is still held out to us and available to us that we want to pursue. And we need to pursue that prudentially. We need to pursue that in a way that's wise and actually adapted to the achievement of the goals that we're aiming for.
All right, on
Well,
to Tocqueville's crystal ball, and the NFL season will begin a week from today.
yeah.
And of course, if you listen to the show, you know that Matt and I are big New England sports fans. So, of course, we love the Patriots as well as the Red Sox. Matt, a lot of change in Foxborough.
Hmm.
What's your take on the Patriots season? How many games will they win? How will the season unfold?
I think I'm cautiously optimistic. I think there's some weaknesses
You're
around the
always
division.
cautiously optimistic.
I guess that's my thing. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's some weakness around the division. I think there's some possibilities there. I mean, Vrabel, I think, is an excellent coach. So I think over time that's going to begin to take hold. So I would put them right on the cusp of a winning season. I think a 7-10 to 10-7, probably more likely 8-9. I guess if I had to pick one number, I'm going to say 8 wins. But I think they're going to be right around there. I think they're going to have some weeks where they look like this is a future playoff team, potential division winner next year or two, and some where they're still not quite there. There's some youth that we have to overcome. You're going to start a couple of rookies on the left side of the offensive line, second year quarterback. That's not going to work out every week, but I think probably as often as not, there will be some sparks there and some good things that'll happen.
So if you're cautiously optimistic, I'm always hyper optimistic. So
Yeah.
the cup is only half full, it's three-quarters full. But I'm going to rein it in a little bit here.
Okay.
I have not been that happy with the preseason. I see those
Yeah.
holes. See,
Yeah.
I was big on an 11-6 season before, but I'm thinking more like 9 wins, where it's going to take some growing pains at the beginning of the season.
Hmm.
But they do have a winning season, and the first part of their schedule is much easier than the second part. But I think they learn Vrabel's way. They learn how to play as a team, and they pull off some bigger wins in the second half of the season to help get them over 500. And they have some early losses that produce a little bit of doubt. Here we go again.
Yeah.
That's how I look at it. So
Okay.
we also have some opening games this first week.
Hmm.
We have the Cowboys in the opener playing the Eagles. The Eagles are 7-point favorites. We have the Chiefs who are favorites over the Chargers. That game's going to be played in Brazil. The Raiders at the Patriots. Patriots are favored by 3. Lions, Packers. Packers slight favorite there. And Ravens at Bills. Once again, the Bills a slight favorite over the Ravens. So who do you think wins each of these 5 games, Matt? So Eagles, Cowboys, who do you have in that game?
I'm going to say Eagles. I think Eagles big. I think the Micah Parsons thing is going to be a problem. And the Eagles are going to want to prove that they're for real coming off their Super Bowl championship. So I think this one's going to be a 2 to 3 touchdown win for the Eagles.
I agree completely. I think the Eagles are going to really flash in this game. How about the Chiefs at the Chargers in Brazil?
I'm going to take the Chargers. I think the Chiefs are due for, a season that's a bit of a struggle. The Travis Kelce distraction. We're ramping that up one more time, one more season of Travis and Taylor. So I think that becomes, a narrative anyway to explain another step perhaps of decline. Still decent team, but I think Chargers win that game.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think the Chiefs are going to have the same season this year. This may be one of those times where someone else wins that division. I'll take the Chargers here too. Raiders at Patriots.
I'm going with the Pats.
I think so as well. I think it'll be a close game, but I think they'll win with the spread. Lions at the Packers. Lions, a great team from last year. Disappointing finish to their season, playing at Green Bay. Great division. What do you make of this game?
I think it's going to be a great game. I'm not sure Jordan Love is quite there yet. I think by the end of the year, he could be one of the top, let's say, 8 or 10 quarterbacks in the league, but I'm not sure he's there to start the season. So I'm going to take Detroit.
I think he is, which may be giving you some input into my fantasy draft next week that we're going to have. But
Yeah.
I say the Packers take this one and Love impresses. Finally, Bills and Ravens. Another great game.
Yeah, that is going to be a great game. I mean, it's just two quarterbacks that can just air it out and run actually all day. I'll take the Bills at home, but it's only a slight preference there.
Yeah, I think that the Ravens have something to prove this year. I think they're going to take this game. I think the Bills are going to have a little bit of a challenging season. I hope the Patriots give them a run for their money for the division, but I'm going to take the Ravens here. So we've got three that we agree upon, the two close games that we disagree upon, and we'll see next time we get together who's right.
How we do. All right, very good. Well, we'll wrap it up there for today. Don't forget, you can now find us on YouTube at DIA Today. You can follow us on Instagram at Democracy in America Today, or you can email us the old-fashioned way at democracyinamericatoday@gmail.com. Look forward to talking to you again soon.